Okay, hey everyone. If you are enjoying the sound of the crickets in the background, it's because I am outside in summertime here in Arkansas. So, um, this is a piece that Lenin wrote in 1895 called Explanation of the Law on Fines Imposed on Factory Workers. I'm going to be reading this piece by piece so that, it could each have its own section and not be too long of a read. You can go down to which one, is spoken about. So, yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's see, he wrote this in 1895. And what this is probably going to see, Lenin was a lawyer. He was a lawyer, and he was a legal professional, and so he studied law. He studied law in Tsarist Russia. So we're going to. And here's the thing. Yeah, we're not going to get any of Lenin's theories in these kinds of writings. Like when this is stuff he distributed to different workers so that they can know the law. So they can avoid arrest. They can avoid, they can, master what they're doing here, So he does this to explain the law, for workers. But what we could use this now in 2021, I mean, we don't live in Tsarist Russia in 1895 in the Russian Empire, but we can learn about the Russian Empire by reading, from an actual lawyer who lived in the Russian Empire. And that lawyer happens to be Lenin, So let's go ahead and get into this. Let's see, part one of explanation of the law on fines imposed on factory workers. 1. What are fines? If we were to ask a worker whether he knows what fines are, the question would very likely astonish him. How can he not know what fines are when he constantly has to pay them? What is there to ask about? However, it only seems that there is nothing to ask about. Actually, most workers do not properly understand fines. It is usually thought that a fine is a payment made to the employer for damage done to him by the worker. That is not true. A fine and compensation for damage are two different things. If a worker does some damage to another worker, the latter may demand compensation for the damage, for a piece of cloth which has been spoiled, but cannot fine him. Similarly, if one factory owner does damage to another, like fails to deliver goods on time, the latter can demand compensation, but he cannot fine the first factory owner. Compensation for damage is demanded of an equal, whereas a fine can only be imposed on a subordinate. Hence, compensation for damage must be claimed in court, whereas a fine is imposed by the employer out of court. A fine is sometimes imposed when the employer has suffered no damage, like a fine for smoking. A fine is a penalty and not compensation for damage. If a worker, let us say, is careless while smoking and burns the employer's clothes, the employer not only fines him for smoking, but in addition makes a deduction for the burnt cloth. This example clearly shows the difference between a fine and compensation for damage. Fines are not imposed to compensate for damage, but to establish discipline, like to secure subordination of the workers to the employer, to force the worker to fulfill the employer's orders, to obey him during working hours. The law on fines, in fact, says that a fine is a monetary penalty imposed by the factory management on its own authority with a view to the maintenance of order. And the amount of the fine depends, therefore, not on the amount of the damage, but on the extent of the worker's misdemeanor. The greater the misdemeanor, the greater the disobedience to the employer or departure from the employer's demands, the greater the fine. If anybody goes to work for an employer, it is clear that he loses his freedom. He must obey his employer, and the employer may punish him. The peasant serfs work for landlords, and the landlords punish them. The workers work for capitalists, and the capitalists punish them. The only difference is that formerly it was a man's back that suffered, whereas now it is his purse. It will perhaps be objected that joint work by a mass of workers at a mill or factory is impossible without discipline. Order is needed on the job. Somebody has to see that order is kept and that those who violate it are punished. Hence, we shall be told, fines are imposed not because the workers are not free, but because joint work requires order. The objection is quite groundless, although at first sight people may be misled by it. It is only put forward by people who wish to conceal from the workers that they are not free agents. Order is certainly necessary wherever work is done jointly. But is it necessary that people who work should be subordinated to the tyranny of the factory owners, for example, of people who do not work themselves and who are only strong because they have taken hold of all the machines, instruments, and materials? Joint work cannot be done unless there is order, unless all submit to it. But work can be done in common without subordinating the workers to the factory owners. Joint work does indeed require that there is a supervision to ensure the maintenance of order, but it does not at all require that the power to supervise others should always be vested in one who does not work himself, but lives on the labor of others. Hence it can be seen that fines are imposed not because people work together, but because under the present capitalist system, all working folk possess no property. All the machines, instruments, raw materials, land, and bread belong to the rich. The workers have to sell themselves to them so as not to starve. Once, however, they have sold themselves, they are, of course, obliged to subordinate themselves to them and suffer punishment at their hands. Every worker desirous of understanding what fines are should be clear on this point. He must know this so as to refute the usual and very mistaken argument that fines are necessary, since without them joint work is impossible. He must know this so as to be able to explain to every worker the difference between a fine and compensation for damage, and why fines mean that the workers are not free, that they are subordinated to the capitalists. Okay, so when we come back, we're going to read Section 2, how were fines imposed formally and what gave rise to the new legislation on fines. And that was what are fines. This is all part of the explanation of the law on fines imposed on factory workers. All right, y'all, hit me up on Mark Sassah, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Dodala Goy.